back to winning isn't easy. Now, I'm often asked in the case of ME/CFS whether or not I should have brain mapping studies. As I've indicated in earlier episodes, there are certain diseases or medical conditions that would warrant neuropsychological testing and other testing to establish an organic basis for the complaints, or to establish an organic basis or an objective basis of the nature of your complaints, the problems that you're having with your executive functioning or memory. Now, how does that work in an ME/CFS case, particularly with brain mapping? First, you have to understand that you, the policyholder or plan beneficiary, have the burden of proof. You have to establish that you meet the basic disability policy or plan eligibility requirements. And part of that is to generally establish an objective basis for the diagnosis, an objective basis of any restrictions and limitations, and then a causal relationship, a link between that diagnosis and your restrictions and limitations and your inability to perform the material and substantial duties of your own occupation or any occupation. Now, disability carriers can't always require objective evidence in cases where there is no gold standard test. So, for example, if you have a Parkinson's disease case or an MS case, normally there are objective testing that will document the presence of an organic cause for the disease. But that's not quite the case in an ME/CFS case. But having gotten past the requirement for objective evidence in a condition that's not susceptible of objective medical evidence of the diagnosis, the carrier can, and the courts have upheld their request that you have objective medical evidence of your restrictions and limitations. And if you don't, the carrier has a legitimate reason for denying the claim. So how about the brain mapping in a case of ME/CFS? Now, as I've said, there are some things that can be used in different medical conditions to prove a diagnosis. And the world of ME/CFS, a functional MRI, a PET scan, an SPECT scan, and a QEEG brain mapping can be used to establish the diagnosis and to quantify restrictions and limitations. Now, the QEEQ is a non-invasive test where electrodes are placed on your scalp. And the purpose of the test is to measure electrical activation and neural activity on the cerebral cortex of your brain. These test results are compared to your age and gender for the people who, as compared to people who don't have symptoms for ME/CFS. And that will provide biological evidence of the diagnosis. However, you have to undergo neuropsychological assessment and testing to validate the QEEG results. If you have ME/CFS, it's expected that your electrical activity will deviate from the norm for your age and your gender. There is some research that suggests that there's an association between the electrical activity in the frontal lobes and impaired executive functioning, such as planning, decision-making, maintaining attention, focus, and concentration. Now, can that brain mapping help you meet the standards of disability in your policy or plan? As I've said, the test results can establish an objective basis for the ME/CFS diagnosis, and these results can provide an organic medical explanation for your complaints that establish the level of your impairment. Now, disability carriers don't always use the word impairment, particularly in their definition section, as a criteria for disability, but ultimately that's what you have to prove. You have to prove that you can't do the material and substantial duties of your occupation. It's the combination of the objective testing and the results of the neuropsychological evaluation that can document and explain the impaired executive functioning that's going to prevent you from doing your occupation or any other occupation. I think that it's the combination of testing that can win the day, but I won't tell you that that's all that you need to prove, because I think you ultimately have to get a vocational evaluation, an opinion to tie together the diagnosis, your occupational duties, and why, from a vocational standpoint, you can't do the material and substantial duties of your own occupation or any occupation, as those terms are defined in your policy. So you can see that in a ME/CFS case, there's a lot of proof requirements that will require, in my view, the assistance of an experienced ERISA disability or ID disability attorney, because we've got to understand the policy, understand your occupation is defined by the policy, understand what testing is appropriate for the neuropsychological testing. We have to have the brain mapping done. We need a doctor to tie all that together. And then ultimately, we need a vocational rehabilitation counselor to tie it all together in a nice package with a bow on top of it. I hope that you've enjoyed this week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy. If you enjoyed this episode, consider liking our page, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends and family. Also, subscribe to this podcast. That way, you'll be notified every time a new episode comes out. Tune in next week for another insightful episode of Winning Isn't Easy. Thanks.